The Norman Conquest is usually told as the story of two men. William the Conqueror, the determined duke from across the Channel, and Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. Their clash at the Battle of Hastings has been painted, sung, and remembered for centuries. But what if this famous story is missing its most important pieces? What if behind the shining armor and royal crowns were countless other figures whose choices, struggles, and sacrifices shaped history just as much, if not more, than the two men we always hear about? Imagine a brother's betrayal that weakened a kingdom before the first arrow was loosed. Picture earls torn between loyalty and survival, their hesitation deciding whether England would resist or fall. Think of a countess who, in a world dominated by men, used marriage, wealth, and strategy to carve out her own authority. Consider nameless peasants who watched their villages burn, yet replanted fields in defiance of despair. Picture the rough hands of artisans chiseling stone into castles and cathedrals that still stand today, silent monuments to lives we no longer remember. These are the hidden actors of the Norman Conquest, and their stories change everything. History is never as simple as one battle, one king, or one conquest. It is a web of voices, many forgotten, yet each leaving echoes that shaped the England we know today. By uncovering these overlooked lives, we find not just a richer past, but lessons about power, resilience, and the ways ordinary people carry extraordinary influence. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will journey beyond William and Harold, exploring the forgotten faces, the common struggles, and the lasting legacies that truly defined the Norman Conquest. When most people think about the Norman Conquest of England, two names immediately rise to the surface of memory. William, Duke of Normandy, who would later be called William the Conqueror, and Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England. Their confrontation at the Battle of Hastings has been etched into the collective imagination, often retold in simple terms of one invader and one defender. William is cast as the determined, resourceful leader who marshaled his forces across the Channel to seize a throne he believed was rightfully his. Harold is seen as the brave but beleaguered king, rushing from one battlefield to another in a desperate attempt to protect his kingdom. The story, as it is often told, ends with Harold lying dead on the field and William crowned in Westminster Abbey, bringing an end to Anglo-Saxon rule. This familiar version of events, however, leaves us with a narrow lens. By focusing so much on William and Harold, the narrative often excludes the many figures whose choices, ambitions, and struggles shaped the outcome just as much as the actions of these two leaders. The story of the conquest is not simply one of a clash between two men. It is the story of a society caught in a storm of change, involving earls, bishops, knights, common soldiers, and even ordinary villagers who bore the brunt of the upheaval. The Norman Conquest was not a duel between two warriors on horseback, but a tapestry woven from the threads of many lives, each pulling history in a slightly different direction. In the traditional account, the spotlight shines on Harold's swift response to an invasion in the north led by Harald Hardrada, the Norwegian king, who was allied with Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig Godwinson. Harold defeated Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, only to be forced to march south immediately when William landed in Sussex. After this grueling journey, Harold faced William at Hastings, where his exhausted army was eventually overwhelmed by Norman cavalry and archers. Harold's death, according to the Bayeux Tapestry and later chronicles, signaled the collapse of English resistance. William took the throne, transforming England's culture, politics, and language in the years that followed. This streamlined story, while dramatic, misses the complex human landscape of the conquest. It reduces a multifaceted struggle into a contest between two strong personalities. When we look beyond William and Harold, we see a much richer and more complicated picture. For example, the role of Harold's brother Tostig is essential. Once the Earl of Northumbria, Tostig had ruled harshly and alienated the local population. His deposition, with Harold's support, sowed resentment and bitterness that drove Tostig to become one of Harold's fiercest enemies. Aligning with Hardrada, he brought Norway's might against his own homeland. Though defeated at Stamford Bridge, Tostig's actions drained Harold's strength before the decisive clash at Hastings. Without Tostig's ambition and anger, Harold might have faced William with a fresher army and stronger morale. In this sense, the conquest was shaped not only by external invasion, but also by the internal fractures of the English nobility. Another overlooked figure is Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and his brother Morcar, Earl of Northumbria. They were powerful lords whose loyalty was crucial in the defense of the realm. After Harold's death, it was these earls who could have rallied resistance against William. Instead, their hesitation and eventual submission weakened the possibility of prolonged English resistance. Their decisions were influenced by political calculation, fear, and perhaps even resentment toward Harold, whose family had dominated much of the kingdom. Their story reminds us that history often turns on moments of indecision as much as on heroic charges. On the Norman side, William did not march into battle alone. His claim to the throne rested in part on the support of the Pope, who sent him a banner of blessing. This papal endorsement gave his invasion the aura of a holy war, encouraging knights from across Europe to join him. Among them were Breton, Flemish, and French allies whose participation was crucial in swelling William's ranks. The Norman cavalry that broke Harold's shield wall was not composed solely of men from Normandy, but of a coalition of adventurers drawn by promises of land and wealth. Their forgotten presence reminds us that conquest was never the achievement of one man, but the coordinated effort of many, bound together by both faith and greed. Then there is the figure of Bishop Odo, William's half-brother, who played both a spiritual and military role in the invasion. Odo is often depicted in the Bayeux tapestry wielding a club, leading troops into battle while encouraging them with the promise of divine support. After the conquest, Odo was rewarded with vast estates, becoming one of the richest men in England. His dual identity as a bishop and war leader exemplifies the blurred line between religion and warfare in this era. He reminds us that the conquest was as much about ideology and legitimacy as it was about swords and spears. We must also consider the anonymous voices of those who fought and suffered. The shield wall at Hastings was made up not only of professional soldiers, but of ordinary ferdmen, local levies summoned from villages and towns. These men left their farms and families to stand against the Norman cavalry. Their courage, their exhaustion after Stamford Bridge, and their eventual slaughter were just as much a part of the conquest as the strategies of kings. They are rarely named in chronicles, yet their sacrifice carried the weight of the kingdom. Likewise, the Norman archers, many of them low-born men, changed the course of the battle with their arrows, one of which is said to have struck Harold. In focusing only on leaders, we forget the hands that actually held the weapons and bore the wounds. The aftermath of Hastings also reveals forgotten actors. After William was crowned, English resistance did not vanish overnight. Leaders such as Hereward the Wake rose in rebellion, rallying local fighters in marshlands and forests. The north of England became the site of brutal reprisals when William carried out the Harrying of the North, a campaign of destruction that left entire regions depopulated. These acts of resistance and repression involved countless unnamed men and women whose lives were destroyed or transformed by the conquest. Their experiences remind us that history is not just about the rise and fall of rulers, but about the human cost of their ambitions. By widening our view beyond William and Harold, we come to see the Norman conquest not as a neat story of two opponents, but as a struggle defined by alliances, betrayals, and countless individual decisions. Tostig's betrayal, the hesitation of the earls, the faith of the Pope, the ambition of Norman barons, and the bravery of common soldiers all shaped the outcome. Even the peasants who saw their lands seized or burned were part of the story, for their suffering marked the deep scars left on England. History becomes richer and more truthful when we recognize these forgotten faces. What emerges is a reminder that no single person ever truly wins or loses a kingdom. William's victory was the product of a vast network of support, and Harold's defeat was the result of pressures from both enemies and allies. When we study this event through a wider lens, we gain not only a clearer picture of how England was transformed, but also a deeper sense of how history itself is made, not by two men alone, but by the choices, sacrifices, and struggles of many. The Norman conquest, once stripped of its simple narrative, becomes a mosaic of human lives, each piece essential in shaping the whole. And by paying attention to those who are often left in the shadows, we can see the past in a way that is more human, more complex, and more true. When we move beyond William and Harold, we begin to notice the lives of men and women who carried their ambitions, their loyalties, and their fears into the uncertain years after Hastings. Among these figures, Earl Edwin of Mercia stands out as both a symbol of English resistance and of the tragic futility faced by the Anglo-Saxon nobility in the wake of conquest. Edwin, like his brother Morcar, was one of the most powerful men in England before the Norman invasion. As Earl of Mercia, He commanded authority across the Midlands and was considered a central pillar of the kingdom's defense. His family had a reputation for leadership, and his loyalty after Harold's death could have been the foundation of continued resistance. Yet his story reveals how even the greatest among the English elite found themselves cornered by circumstance and forced into decisions that gradually stripped them of both dignity and power. In the weeks following the Battle of Hastings, Edwin and Morcar held the ability to rally forces in their territories. The citizens of London even looked to them for leadership, weighing the possibility of crowning Edgar Atheling, the last male descendant of the royal house of Wessex. Edgar was young, inexperienced, and politically weak, but he carried the bloodline of Alfred the Great, which made him an attractive figurehead. Edwin could have placed himself at the center of a renewed coalition, with Edgar as the symbolic king and himself as the true power behind the throne. Yet hesitation, and perhaps a recognition of William's military superiority, stalled his resolve. The Norman forces advanced with deliberate speed, securing towns, intimidating populations, and cutting off the possibility of organized resistance. Edwin and Morcar submitted, swearing loyalty to William in the hope of preserving their estates and their lives. This choice, however, did not bring stability. William, wary of their influence, treated them with calculated suspicion. The brothers were rewarded with certain privileges, but also stripped of autonomy. Their political position shrank under Norman oversight, and their failure to assert a strong English alternative to William's rule left them in a vulnerable position. In the following years, Edwin's restlessness grew. He resented his loss of independence, and he resented the Norman redistribution of land that pushed English lords further into irrelevance. His simmering frustration eventually erupted into rebellion. Edwin, along with Morcar, joined insurrections that flared across the country, from uprisings in the north to the resistance movements in the fens. These rebellions were driven by both pride and desperation, a refusal to accept the dismantling of the old English order. Edwin's fate was grim. In his final rebellion, he attempted to reassert his authority by gathering men in the north. Yet betrayal followed him. As he moved with his supporters, he was surrounded and killed, his severed head sent to William as proof of his defeat. His story illustrates the tragic reality faced by the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. They were too powerful to be ignored, yet too weakened to truly resist. Edwin's struggle and downfall show that the conquest was not a single event concluded at Hastings, but a drawn-out process in which the English nobility were gradually crushed, either through violence or through the erosion of their independence. He is remembered not only as a defeated noble, but as a figure who attempted, however unsuccessfully, to carve out a space for English resistance in the shadow of Norman power. Yet the story of the conquest is not only a tale of defeated men. It is also a tale of women who wielded authority in ways often overlooked by chroniclers. Countess Judith of Lens, William's niece, offers an intriguing example of female influence in an age dominated by male warriors and kings. Judith was the daughter of Lambert of Lens and Adelaide of Normandy, which made her a member of the extended ducal family. Her marriage to Waltheof, Earl of Northumbria, tied her to one of the most prominent Anglo-Saxon noblemen of the post-conquest period. This union was no accident. It was a calculated move designed to bind a powerful English earl to the Norman regime, offering both loyalty and legitimacy. Judith's role, however, extended far beyond being a political bride. She emerged as one of the great landholders of the new Norman England. After Waltheof was executed for his part in rebellion against William, Judith retained significant estates, becoming one of the wealthiest women of her time. Her control of lands, her connections to the ducal family, and her position as a widow gave her unusual independence. She maneuvered through the treacherous politics of the era with caution and skill. In many ways, she exemplifies how women, though often sidelined in military narratives, exercised real influence through land, marriage alliances, and kinship ties. Judith's significance also lay in her role as a cultural bridge. As a Norman woman married into an Anglo-Saxon family, she embodied the merging of two worlds. Her estates brought together tenants of different backgrounds, and her presence in the north connected Norman authority with local traditions. Though her life was marked by tragedy, her husband's execution, her own precarious position in the shifting political order, she demonstrates that women were not passive spectators of the conquest, but active participants in its unfolding drama. Her story broadens our understanding of power, showing that authority in the 11th century was not confined to the battlefield, but also resided in the halls of estates, in the networks of family, and in the ability to manage wealth and influence. If Edwin's story speaks to the doomed resistance of the English nobility, and Judith's story illuminates the power of women in a patriarchal society, the career of Eustace of Boulogne offers yet another perspective, that of an opportunistic continental magnate whose fortunes rose and fell with the tide of conquest. Eustace was a seasoned noble, Count of Boulogne, and a man with ambitions that stretched across the Channel. His presence at Hastings has been the subject of both recognition and controversy. According to some accounts, it was Eustace who urged William to retreat when the Norman forces wavered during the battle, a moment that nearly decided the outcome. Other sources suggest that he later rallied and returned with force, contributing to the eventual victory. This ambiguity reflects the complex nature of Eustace's role. He was not simply William's subordinate, but a powerful ally with his own interests. After the conquest, Eustace sought to secure lands in England, strengthening his position both on the continent and across the Channel. His ambition brought him into conflict with William, revealing the tensions within the coalition that had secured the throne. Unlike many of William's supporters, who were content to settle in England and carve out estates, Eustace maintained his focus on continental politics as well, seeking to balance his holdings in both realms. His later history is marked by both opportunity and struggle. At times, his relationship with William soured, leading to clashes over territory and authority. At other moments, they cooperated, recognizing their shared interest in consolidating power. Eustace's career demonstrates that the conquest was not only an English story, but also part of a broader European landscape in which lords and counts maneuvered across borders, forming alliances and rivalries that extended beyond any single kingdom. His legacy would endure through his descendants, who became central figures in the First Crusade, carrying the ambitions of Boulogne onto the stage of world history. Taken together, the lives of Edwin, Judith, and Eustace show us that the Norman conquest was not shaped only by the clash between William and Harold. It was shaped by the resistance of English earls who fought and fell, by the influence of noble women who navigated the storm with skill, and by ambitious continental magnates who used the conquest as a springboard for their own designs. They remind us that history is rarely the work of two figures alone. It is the product of countless lives intersecting, each leaving its own mark. The Norman conquest is often remembered through the clash of nobles and kings, but once we step away from the thrones and the earldoms, a different history emerges, one written in the lives of the common people. These were the peasants who tilled the fields, the soldiers who trudged in mud beneath the banners of others, and the artisans whose hands shaped stone into fortresses and cathedrals. They were not chronicled by name, yet they bore the heaviest weight of conquest. To understand the true scope of what followed Hastings, it is not enough to recount the fates of earls and counts. We must also listen to the voices that history seldom recorded, for it was they who carried the daily burdens of change, disruption, and survival. For the Anglo-Saxon peasant, the conquest was less about the death of a king on a battlefield and more about the reshaping of their lives in every detail. Before William's armies landed on English shores, peasants lived under a system of obligations to local lords. They farmed the land, owed labor, and paid dues, but they also enjoyed customs that were familiar and tied to generations of tradition. When the Normans arrived, these customs were swept aside with startling speed. The land they had worked was no longer in the hands of familiar Anglo-Saxon lords, but seized and redistributed to Norman barons and knights. What had once been their local community, under an English, then became the estate of a foreign overlord. This change was not merely symbolic. It was recorded and enforced with extraordinary precision in the Domesday Book, William's monumental survey of his new kingdom. For peasants, this meant that every strip of land, every animal, and every duty was catalogued under the watchful eyes of Norman officials. Their lives were no longer defined by flexible local arrangements, but by a rigid system designed to extract as much wealth as possible for their new masters. This was a profound shock, one that introduced new burdens, including heavier taxes and harsher enforcement. The Anglo-Saxon tongue they spoke began to shift as Norman French trickled into daily speech, first in the courts and churches, then in administration, and slowly into the language of the market. For a peasant, this meant that even the words spoken by their children were no longer entirely their own. The disruption was not only in governance, but in violence. During William's harrying of the north, when resistance rose in Yorkshire and beyond, whole villages were put to the torch. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, and populations starved into submission. For peasants caught in the middle, loyalty mattered little. Whether they supported English rebels or submitted to Norman lords, the result was often the same: ruin, hunger, and displacement. Archaeological evidence from this period shows abandoned settlements, charred remains, and skeletons marked by both malnutrition and brutality. The conquest was not just a change of rulers. It was a deep wound inflicted upon the common people who had no say in the matter. Yet amid this suffering, peasants endured. They adapted to the new order, learned to navigate the demands of their Norman lords, and gradually shaped the evolving identity of England. Their resilience is part of the story. Though their names are lost, their persistence allowed villages to recover, fields to be replanted, and families to survive. They represent the continuity of life beneath the upheaval of kings and conquerors. While peasants bore the brunt of conquest on the English side, on the Norman side another overlooked figure emerges: the foot soldier. When history remembers William's invasion, it conjures images of mounted knights in chainmail, thundering across the field at Hastings. Yet for every knight there were numerous infantrymen, men who marched, dug, fought, and bled without the glory reserved for the cavalry. These soldiers were drawn from Normandy, Brittany, Flanders, and other parts of northern France, often by promises of land, plunder, or spiritual reward. Some were bound by feudal obligation to follow their lords, while others joined as mercenaries, seeking fortune in a foreign land. The reality of their lives was harsh. Recruitment meant leaving behind families, farms, and familiar fields. The voyage across the Channel was perilous, with storms threatening to scatter the fleet. Once in England, the soldiers faced not just battle, but also the grind of occupation. They built fortifications, guarded supply lines, and endured the hostility of a local population that saw them as invaders. Their rations were meager, their armor heavy, and their prospects uncertain. Many never received the land or riches they had been promised. Instead, they found themselves garrisoned in newly built castles, living in cramped wooden structures, enforcing Norman rule in unfriendly territory. On the battlefield, their role was essential. At Hastings, the infantry absorbed the brunt of Harold's shield wall, pressing forward again and again while cavalry regrouped. Their casualties were heavy, but their persistence wore down the English defenses. In the years that followed, these soldiers became the backbone of Norman occupation, holding castles in hostile regions, suppressing uprisings, and ensuring the survival of the new regime. Yet their names, like those of the peasants they fought against, are largely forgotten. They were tools of conquest, vital yet anonymous, caught between the ambitions of their lords and the hostility of the land they helped subdue. Alongside peasants and soldiers stood another group whose contribution, though quieter, left an enduring legacy: the artisans and builders who shaped the physical landscape of Norman England. Castles rose across the kingdom, first as wooden motte and bailey structures and later as imposing stone fortresses. These fortifications were not conjured by the will of lords alone, but built by the hands of skilled masons, carpenters, and laborers. Churches and cathedrals, too, were transformed. Norman architecture, with its soaring arches and massive stone walls, demanded both vision and craftsmanship. The artisans who cut stone, carved ornamentation, and raised timber frames played a role as significant as any knight, for their work cemented Norman authority in stone and mortar. These builders were sometimes Normans brought across the Channel, but often they were English craftsmen adapting their skills to new demands. The conquest thus fostered a fusion of traditions, as Anglo-Saxon building techniques blended with continental styles. The great cathedrals of Durham and Ely, the castles of London and Colchester, and countless smaller structures all bear the mark of these anonymous artisans. Their labor reshaped the very face of England, leaving a physical legacy that outlasted the memories of battles and kings. The story of the artisan is not only one of skill, but also of survival. To work on a Norman project meant security, wages, and perhaps protection, even in a time of turmoil. Artisans could negotiate a place in the new order, their talents making them indispensable to Norman lords eager to display power and piety. Through their chisels and hammers, they transformed a conquered land into one that reflected the authority of its conquerors. In doing so, they also left behind monuments that became part of England's identity, blending conquest with continuity in ways no battlefield could. Together, the peasant, the soldier, and the artisan give us a fuller picture of the conquest's impact. For the peasant, it was a story of loss, suffering, and adaptation. For the soldier, it was one of hardship, service, and uncertain reward. For the artisan, it was a story of labor that reshaped a kingdom and left traces still visible today. These voices, though faint in the chronicles, remind us that history is not only written in the deeds of kings, but in the endurance of those who lived beneath them. The Norman Conquest was not only a battle of crowns, but a transformation of everyday life, carried on the backs, shoulders, and hands of people whose names we may never know. The legacies of the Norman Conquest did not vanish with the fall of Harold on the battlefield, or with the submission of English nobles in the years that followed. What endured were the countless strands of inheritance, influence, and cultural change woven through the lives of both the conquerors and the conquered. These threads were not limited to William and his direct heirs, nor were they confined to the Norman nobility, who received the largest estates. They extended into the genealogies of families that rose or fell because of the conquest, into the blending of traditions that shaped English culture, and into the quiet lessons left behind by those who resisted, adapted, or endured. To understand how this moment echoes through time, we must look beyond the battlefield to the deeper and often surprising legacies that emerged from those who lived in its shadow. Genealogical legacies can be some of the most striking. The descendants of Norman magnates who were scarcely remembered in chronicles later rose to positions of immense influence. Eustace of Boulogne, for example, who played such a contested role at Hastings, passed his ambitions to his sons. They became some of the most prominent leaders of the First Crusade, with Godfrey of Bouillon becoming a ruler in Jerusalem. In this way, the Norman Conquest indirectly shaped the history of the crusading movement, as fortunes won in England contributed to ventures in the Holy Land. What began as the claim of one duke to a throne rippled outward into the transformation of Christendom itself, and the names of families like that of Eustace carried weight across continents. On the Anglo-Saxon side, even in defeat, genealogies retained importance. The House of Wessex, though stripped of its crown, continued through Edgar Atheling. Though he never ruled, his lineage connected him to royal courts across Europe. He spent time in exile in Hungary, traveled to Scotland, and even joined campaigns abroad. His bloodline linked him to later dynasties, ensuring that Anglo-Saxon heritage was not extinguished, but rather dispersed and interwoven with continental families. Similarly, the descendants of lesser earls and thanes often found ways to survive by marrying into Norman families or serving under them, creating a mingling of ancestries that re-emerged in later generations. By the time of the Plantagenets, English rulers bore in their veins both Norman ambition and Anglo-Saxon resilience. Even figures like Edwin and Morcar, though ultimately doomed in their resistance, represent the persistence of genealogical memory. Their houses may have lost power, but their names lingered in regional traditions, stories, and in some cases, minor branches of families that persisted in local prominence. The Normans sought to erase or replace English aristocracy, but bloodlines have a way of resurfacing, even in unexpected places. In this way, the conquest created a paradoxical legacy. While it shattered the political order of Anglo-Saxon England, it also scattered its lineage into new soil, where it quietly influenced later generations. Beyond the genealogies, the cultural fusion that arose from the conquest may be the most enduring legacy of all. The English language itself bears the mark of this blending. The Anglo-Saxon tongue, already evolving from its Germanic roots, absorbed waves of Norman French vocabulary. Words for governance, law, art, and even everyday life entered English speech. This linguistic fusion did not happen overnight, but unfolded over centuries, producing a language that was flexible, layered, and rich in nuance. By the time Chaucer wrote in Middle English, the fusion was unmistakable, creating a foundation for the language we speak today. Law and administration also reveal this blending. The Normans brought with them new methods of record-keeping, as seen most famously in the Domesday Book, but they did not erase every Anglo-Saxon practice. Instead, they adapted local systems, incorporating English shire courts and customary law into their broader framework. This hybrid administration allowed Norman rulers to govern effectively while also grounding their authority in practices familiar to their subjects. Over time, this blend produced a uniquely English system of governance, neither wholly Norman nor wholly Anglo-Saxon, but something distinct, something that would influence the growth of parliamentary traditions in later centuries. Art and architecture tell the same story. The soaring stone cathedrals of the Normans were built upon the skills of English artisans. Decorative motifs from Anglo-Saxon tradition found their way into Norman designs, just as continental styles reshaped the skyline of English towns. The Romanesque arches, the fortress-like castles, and the intricate carvings left a physical imprint that still defines the landscape. Yet within those forms one can still detect hints of the older English tradition, preserved not because the Normans sought to honor it, but because artisans and builders carried it forward. The result is a cultural fusion that became inseparable from English identity, a blend that continues to shape perceptions of heritage today. Even social structures bore the marks of fusion. The rigid feudal hierarchy imposed by the Normans was softened by the persistence of local customs and the adaptability of English peasants. Over time, the system evolved into something distinct from the models found in Normandy or France. The resistance of peasants, whether through small acts of defiance or through survival under oppression, played a role in shaping this unique outcome. Though their contributions were not celebrated in chronicles, their persistence shaped the society that emerged. From these stories of genealogy and culture arises a deeper lesson about power and resistance. The conquest shows that power is rarely absolute, even when it appears overwhelming. William may have claimed the throne, but his authority was constantly tested by rebellions, dissent, and the sheer difficulty of imposing rule on a diverse land. Resistance took many forms. Open rebellion by earls like Edwin, secret plotting by nobles, passive endurance by peasants, or the quiet shaping of culture by artisans. None of these forms of resistance prevented the conquest, yet together they altered its course. They demonstrate that even those without crowns can shape history through persistence, adaptation, and agency. The conquest also reveals the fragility of power. Edwin, once one of the greatest earls of England, lost everything despite his title and influence. Judith of Lens, a woman in a patriarchal age, gained immense wealth and influence through her marriage and widowhood. Eustace of Boulogne, a participant in one battle, saw his descendants rise to power in distant lands. Power shifted not only through victory in battle, but through alliances, betrayals, and sheer survival. The lesson is clear. History is not a story of the strong crushing the weak, but of countless negotiations of power, where even those on the margins can alter the outcome. Ultimately, the Norman Conquest reminds us that adaptation is as important as resistance. The Anglo-Saxon peasants who endured, the Norman soldiers who settled, and the artisans who built new monuments all adapted to the new reality, ensuring that life continued. This adaptation was not passive submission, but an act of resilience, preserving traditions while absorbing change. The England that emerged was not simply Norman or Anglo-Saxon, but something new, shaped by the interplay of conqueror and conquered alike. In tracing these legacies, we see that the Norman Conquest was not just a moment of rupture, but a process of transformation. The genealogies of forgotten nobles and magnates threaded their way into later dynasties. The cultural fusion reshaped language, law, and art. The stories of resistance and adaptation reveal timeless truths about how individuals, even when seemingly powerless, influence the broader sweep of history. From peasants in burned-out villages to artisans chiseling stone, from widowed countesses to rebellious earls, each left echoes that can still be heard today. The conquest may have been won by William, but its legacy belongs to all who lived through it, whether they wielded a crown or carried a plow. Their stories, often hidden in the shadows, reveal that history is not only about kings and battles. It is about endurance, adaptation, and the human capacity to leave a mark, even in the face of overwhelming change. These echoes through time remind us that no life is too small to shape history, and no conquest is ever as simple as the clash of two men on a single battlefield. The story of the Norman Conquest, as we have traced it through kings, nobles, peasants, soldiers, and artisans, teaches us something profound about the way history is told and remembered. Too often, the past is framed as the contest of a few heroic or villainous figures whose decisions supposedly determine the fate of nations. In the case of 11th century England, the narrative of William and Harold has dominated the imagination for generations. It is easy to see why. Two leaders, one throne, a climactic battle, and a dramatic outcome. Yet when history is reduced to such a tale, it becomes dangerously simplified. The danger of a single narrative is that it excludes the multitude of voices that gave shape to events. It risks turning history into myth, into a story of destiny rather than a record of lived experience. The danger of single narratives lies not only in what they say, but in what they leave unsaid. By telling the story of the conquest as if it were only William's triumph and Harold's defeat, We forget the betrayals that weakened Harold's position, the shifting loyalties of English earls, the desperation of peasants facing famine, and the artisans whose buildings stood as silent but enduring testaments to the new order. We lose sight of the roles played by women like Judith of Lens, whose landholdings and alliances reveal that power was not only wielded on battlefields, but also in households and estates. We miss the nuance of Norman allies like Eustace of Boulogne, whose ambitions extended well beyond England. By focusing on the two most famous figures, we risk assuming that history is a simple duel rather than a complicated web of decisions, accidents, and human struggles. This oversimplification distorts our understanding of the past, but it also limits our ability to see parallels in our own time. If we believe that only great leaders shape history, we may overlook the power of ordinary people, small communities, or even single acts of defiance or creativity. We might assume that the world moves only at the command of those at the top, rather than through the combined actions of countless individuals. The Norman Conquest, when viewed fully, proves otherwise. The power of individual agency emerges clearly when we look deeper. Tostig Godwinson's resentment set in motion events that weakened his own brother Harold before Hastings. Edwin's hesitation and later rebellion shaped the course of resistance in the north. Judith's maneuvering preserved her estates and ensured that her family line remained prominent in a changing order. Eustace's disputed decisions on the battlefield contributed to moments of both weakness and recovery in William's army. None of these figures commanded the entire sweep of events, yet each nudged the story in a different direction. Even the nameless peasant who tilled the land after it was burned in the harrying of the north had agency, for by planting again he contributed to the survival of his community, ensuring that life endured in the face of devastation. Individual agency is not only about visible acts of rebellion or leadership, but about persistence and adaptation. The Norman foot soldier who endured hunger, disease, and hostility helped sustain William's occupation. The artisan who learned to carve stone in new ways contributed to the buildings that came to symbolize Norman power. The women who taught their children a language that blended Anglo-Saxon and Norman French shaped the tongue that would become English. None of these people may have seen themselves as shaping history, but they did so nonetheless. History is often the sum of countless small choices made in the shadows. Recognizing this does not diminish the importance of kings or nobles. William's determination and Harold's bravery mattered, but it places them within a broader tapestry where their choices intersect with those of many others. The conquest was not simply a duel won on one day in Hastings, but a transformation carried out through the combined actions of rebels, collaborators, builders, farmers, priests, soldiers, and children who inherited a changed world. This recognition enriches our understanding and makes history more human, more complex, and more truthful. And so we arrive at a call to action, one that extends far beyond the study of this single event. When we approach history, we must resist the temptation to accept the single narrative. We must question what we are told and ask whose voices are missing. We must look beyond the obvious heroes and villains to uncover the hidden figures whose contributions, whether through power or through suffering, shaped the world we inherit. The story of the Norman Conquest is not complete without peasants, artisans, women, and minor nobles, and the same is true of every historical moment. The task, then, is ours. We must search for the untold stories, whether in chronicles, in archaeology, in local traditions, or in the silences of official accounts. We must be willing to imagine the lives of those who were not celebrated, to recognize that their actions mattered, even if no one carved their names into stone. We must treat history not as a simple tale of winners and losers, but as a vast landscape of human experience, where every ridge and valley contributes to the shape of the whole. In doing so, we not only gain a clearer picture of the past, but also cultivate a richer understanding of the present. We learn to question simplified stories told about our own world, to recognize the complexity behind events that may seem straightforward. We learn that power is fragile, that resistance can take many forms, and that even the smallest act can leave echoes through time. The Norman Conquest shows us this truth in vivid detail. A peasant's endurance, a soldier's march, an artisan's hand, a widow's choice, a brother's betrayal, all of these mattered. To look deeper is to honor the fullness of history. It is to say that no life is insignificant, that no act is without consequence, and that the past is richer than the narrow tales we often inherit. When we unveil history's nuances, we do more than understand what happened centuries ago. We learn how to see our own time with sharper eyes, to question, to seek, and to remember that history is always a shared creation. This is why we must look deeper, not to strip away the stories of kings, but to add to them the countless other voices that make the past, and the present, what it truly is.